Now, I want to talk about the spiritual aspects, the first Romans chapter 1 stuff as well, because it is really Paul's argument that lays the basis for the secular arguments. And that's what we don't understand. Some people think, how can you, as a matter of fact, I got a message today, oh, how can you use human-based arguments? Well, if you say the Bible says don't do it, that's not going to cut water. What you have to do is say, here's the argument that I have. You don't have to tell them the source is the Bible. But you can offer the argument, and if you can tactfully explain it, then you're better off. Okay, so I had a person write me and says, while my religion teaches that marriage is definitively a covenant between a man and a woman and the true and living God, how can I impose or write into law my religious practices and force them upon another? You see, even good Christians are torn on this issue. A lot of younger Christians haven't thought it through, and some folks will even tell you Jesus preached a gospel of love and acceptance, therefore we should love and accept them. How does that hurt you? Okay, well, that's not what Paul is saying here. He's pretty clear. So let's go through this. If it's simply a civil institution, then why are we trying to protect it so adamantly? We are simply trying to keep the name and definition of the word in our back pockets. But by doing so, we are keeping the name and definition of the word, we are imposing our views upon other religions and other denominations through the use of our government, thus usurping the very principles our freedom was founded upon. Is that true? How do you answer a person with that kind of an objection? Because that's a thoughtful objection. I think that he's trying to make a cogent point. Well, let's go through this one by one. First of all, what does Paul say here? Paul says that God delivered them over to degrading passions, for the females exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Right? The males in the same way also left natural relations with females and were inflamed in lust for one another. Notice the word natural that shows up throughout that position. There is a natural course to life. See, human beings are biological as well as spiritual. You can't divorce the two. Marriage as a human institution is not created by the government. It is created by God. Right? And the two shall become one flesh, it says in Genesis chapter 2. Matter of fact, Jesus points to that. And he confirms that marriage is between a man and a woman. In Matthew 19, he held to the sanctity of marriage, in Matthew 19, 4 and 5. The biblical view of homosexuality is it violates that natural order. There are 9 specific references to homosexuality in the 4 in the Old Testament and 5 in the New. If you want those, I'll give them to you, but I'm not going to spend too much time going through them. In Paul's argument, he says the natural order is evident to all people, that all you have to do is look, right? For example, if you look at a car, we can all look at a car, and we can, by looking at a car carefully, understand that you cannot drive this underwater. A car is not built, nor is it designed to function under the water. You need electricity, you need sparks, right? You need ignition and explosion. How do you do that if the battery is submerged, if the spark plugs, it doesn't make sense. Similarly, we can look at our biology and say human beings are meant to fit together a certain way. Okay? Does this make sense to you? Matter of fact, our reproductive organs only function as intended when opposite sexes couple. What is the primary intent of our reproductive organs? Reproduction. I hope that's evident enough. Reproduction can only occur when it's a man-woman coupling. Simple. This is easy. This is undeniable. There has never been a case where a man-man coupling or a woman-woman coupling has produced a child. Those reproductive organs are ill-equipped to function in that situation. But people chose to ignore or disobey God's law, verses 21 through 23, for their own preferences and pleasures, for their lust, for the things that burned within them. They promoted as normal, right? Although they knew the ordinance of God, they not only do the same, verse 32 says, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Wow, that is our situation in a nutshell. So Paul's argument is what you're doing doesn't fit with the way your bodies have been built. Okay, I think that's effective. Now, you're going to run into some problems if you stop there. But for right now, we'll hold on to that and we'll keep going. Marriage and the sexual act, as an institution given by God, perform other functions. Properly exercised, marital relations are the ultimate expression of giving of yourself. They are selfless acts. When you get married, you aren't getting married to see what your wife can get to you. If you're only getting married to make sure that she gives you the warm feelies every day, you got a problem. Because let me tell you, the time is going to come where that's not going to happen. When my wife and I had our first child, I remember the 2 o'clock in the morning projectile vomiting. And you don't want to be selfless then. And he's like, I got to get up at 6. What are we going to, But she doesn't want necessarily for it all to always fall upon her. So there's no warm feelies at projectile vomiting. There just isn't. So we picked up the child and spent an hour and a half in the emergency room, and he started playing, and we said, okay, whatever he needed was out of him, so let's go back home. So this is how marriage actually works. A lot of fun. I have 4 boys, and let me tell you, it's been an education. I found that, in Norco they have tack and feed stores, and you can buy a cattle prod there. No, I didn't use that. Thought about it, but no, I didn't use it. B.F. Skinner method of character development. Marital relations honors your spouse. It keeps you from sin, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. It brings forth the blessing of children. To everybody? No. But certainly to the majority of people across human history who have been married, children are the result. In fact, and I'm going to emphasize this again and again, and my wording is very specific here. In all of human history, there has only been one institution which it is recognized as the proper institution in which to rear children, to produce and rear children. There has only been one institution across all of human history where we should produce and rear children. It is not the government. It is not whomever loves the child the most. It is the parents. It is the marriage relationship. That is the only institution ever recognized as the proper organization to rear children. And lastly, as I said, it is commanded by God, Genesis 1:28. Okay? God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So it was commanded by God that we would be fruitful and multiply, to come together, to express ourselves in this way. Okay, so that's the case for marriage from the Christian perspective. This is how we understand it. But we can take those concepts and apply them in secular settings. First of all, the concept that the gentleman asked about, what did he say specifically? I want to get the wording just right. He said, we are simply, if it is simply a civil institution, then why are we trying to protect it so adamantly? Is marriage a civil institution? Does the government grant us the right to marry? I would argue no. The government does not grant us the right to marry any more than the government grants us the right to speak freely. The government recognizes certain rights that we have, and in that recognition comes certain perhaps benefits, come certain responsibilities that the government places on us. But it is a recognition of marriage. It is not a definition of marriage. You see, marriage is part of what I would call the natural law. And to think that governments can define marriage is to deny natural law. Look, there are 3 types of ways, and I have them on your sheet here. There are 3 types of ways people can be governed within any society. In other words, laws come out of these 3 types of concepts. So we're going to go back to the ideology here. Okay? First of all, there's societal creations. Now you guys are familiar with this kind of stuff. We drive our cars here on the right-hand side of the road. Is it immoral to drive your cars on the left? Well, if you're in America, probably, because there could be oncoming traffic. It's not a good idea anyway. No, but in the UK, driving on the left versus driving on the right, that's a societal convention. It doesn't matter as long as everybody's kind of agreed that this is the way we're going to do things, right? It's that thing. The US mail system, for example, the government constructs that societal creation for our benefit, or even the recognition of corporations as a legal entity. We do that for convenience sake because it helps us with our, but those aren't necessary. Societies don't need any of those things. Matter of fact, societies have existed without all of those things. So societal creations, things that government just decide, marriage doesn't fit in that category because you can't have a society without marriage. These are arbitrary. There's another type, which is societal conventions, I should say. So you have societal creations, things that government make up. Societal conventions. Conventions are things that usually you see all societies have, but how that's expressed, the government has to come in and regulate. Money, the creation of money. Most every society has had some kind of exchange of wealth, you know, services, barter, whatever the case may be. Shows of respect. This is another societal convention. Do you shake with your right hand? Do you bow? Do you use specific titles? How do you treat, you know, a dignitary? Things like that. These aren't necessarily things that the government has created out of nothing. They've existed because cultures have developed them over the years. But they aren't, again, mandatory. They're usually modeled for cooperation. The wedding ring is a good societal convention. Most people will recognize it as marriage, but not everybody. Slaves, for example, in the pre-antebellum South, if they would have to jump the broomstick. They didn't have rings. They were too poor. But that doesn't mean that they weren't married because they didn't have a ring. So that's a societal convention. We recognize certain aspects of how our society works. David Hume defined a convention as, quote, a sense of common interest, which sense each man feels in his own breast, which he remarks in his fellows, and which carries him in concurrence with others into a general plan or system of action, which tends to public utility. So it has an end. If we didn't have money, it would be pretty tough to do business, right? We have a public interest in money, but the government didn't come up with the idea of money. Money has always been around. It's just, it was in its best, because there was a public end to it, it's in its best interest to kind of capitalize on that. Okay, this is going to be $1, this is going to be a $5 bill, things like that. The third thing, though, and this is a relatively recent, this comes in the age of reason that I was talking about, is natural laws. And this is what our country was founded upon, was natural laws. Things like all men are created equal. Does the government grant us that? No. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is written because the government of Britain was not recognizing the fact that all men were created equal, and that's the reason they gave, one of them, for revolution being an appropriate measure. Okay, you're following me? Natural laws are what all of us naturally have that no government can bestow upon nor take away. You may not recognize a person's ability. For example, the slave in the antebellum South was still equal to the slave owner. All men were created equal, even if the slave owner and the government didn't recognize that. You follow me? Just because our government didn't recognize it didn't make it untrue. Thou shalt not murder. There's a good one. That's a natural law. If you're killing for no other reason than pleasure, you're wrong. I don't care if everybody says it's okay. Natural laws are moral imports that exist within all people, whether or not society ever recognizes them. They're fundamental to humanity. They're given by God. They can't be taken away by government institutions. And we recognize these rights and respect them as such. Martin Luther King says, quote, "How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And that's exactly what Romans 1:19 says. Right? Even atheists can't disregard these kinds of ideas. Atheists may not have any logical justification for holding to them, but they have to recognize, they don't have to. If they don't recognize all men are created equal, you're worried about them, right? They would be considered either immoral or schizophrenic, maybe a sociopath, if they don't hold to at least these basic concepts. Now, my argument is that traditional marriage falls within this third classification. It is a natural law. It is part of our biology, just as the Apostle Paul says. Civilization is a gathering of individuals who had already established themselves through marriage-like commitments. So this is the first thing. We tend to think of civilizations as groups of individuals who've all gotten together for a collective purpose. And I think that's wrong. Civilizations, societies, cities don't form with one-offs, with individuals coming together independently. Civilizations form out of the family structure. The family precedes the society. And when a family gets large enough and tends to do things a certain way, historically they have either broken off and established themselves in the way they do that thing, or they've clashed with other families, and a lot of times there's a war and we find out which family is going to win and which societal conventions we're going to accept. But it's the family unit that's the building block of every society. And the family unit is, by the way, always been, again, father and mother and children. So how can you build a wall or build a society out of a block that consists of a male and female procreating and bearing children, and turn around and say, that's not a block wall at all, that's a picket fence? What homosexual marriage has tried to do is redefine the constituency of society. Do you see what I'm saying? And by so doing, they can try to do that. I mean, we do this all the time. We call men women, women men, Yes, you can have all the plastic surgery you want, but that doesn't change your XY chromosome. In every single, plastic surgery doesn't make you a woman. It makes you a man who looks like a woman, who may act like a woman, but you'll always be a man. I'll do a whole thing on transsexual stuff maybe in a later date. There's some interesting arguments there too, but we'll save that. So, a dysfunctional family is one that isn't operating in this dynamic. One can inspect the parts of a family and see if they're functional or dysfunctional, right? If the father is beating the wife or beating the children, that would be a sign that the family unit is out of order and needs to be corrected because it's endangering to the society. Catherine Young and Paul Nathanson argue that marriage as a union of male and female is built on our very biology and therefore cannot be legislated into something else. Young and Nathanson are two Canadian psychologists. Nathanson, by the way, is homosexual. And this is what he says, quote, "But discrimination to maintain marriage as it has long been defined should be allowed in view of the fact that marriage as a universal institution and the essential cultural complement to biology is prior to all concepts of law." So they're agreeing with me here that marriage, the joining of a man and a woman, coupling together in a union in order to rear children in their proper environment, comes prior to law. Francis Beckwith argues similarly when he writes, quote, "The argument against same-sex marriage is based on the nature of the human persons as gendered beings who have a purpose that is derived from that nature. That is to say, male-gendered human persons are meant for coupling with female-gendered human persons, even if their coupling does not result in procreation. This argument is not based on the human person's current function, ability, desire, each of which are incidental with how human persons ought to be by nature. For example, a person who is blind is lacking something physically, though he or she is still a human person who by nature ought to be seeing. Blind person, we say, Yes, there is a physical abnormality, something that's deviating from the norm. In the same way, a sterile, aged, or willingly childless person is still a gendered human person whose purpose for marital union, if he or she doesn't have the gift of celibacy, can be consummated only by the one flesh communion with someone of the opposite gender. This remains true even if he or she has desires that are contrary to what he or she ought to desire by nature. So that's what we see. By the way, this concept came up last week in the Supreme Court arguments. I got to read through the oral arguments. And Justice Kennedy actually, almost right out of the box, in the very first questioning of the solicitor, Mrs. Bonadu, Kennedy said to her, one of the problems is when you think about these cases, you think about words or cases, and the word that keeps coming back to me in this case is millennia plus time. First of all, there has not been really time, so the respondents say, for the federal system to engage in this debate. The separate states, that is, the states haven't had enough time. You took this all the way up to the Supreme Court. There's just not been enough time for the states to say how they would handle these things or what the impact may be. And Kennedy goes on, but on a larger scale, it's been about the same time between Brown and Loving, those are two other cases, as between Lawrence and this case. It's been about 10 years. And so there's time for the scholars and the commentators and the bar and the public to engage in it. But still, 10 years is, I don't even know how to count the decimals when we talk about millennia. What is 10 years versus millennia of human history? This definition has been with us for millennia, and it's very difficult for the court to say, oh, well, we know better. That's a good argument. I mean, he's asking a right question, right? That's Kennedy. He's the vote upon which all of this turns. So some of the pro-natural marriage crowd got very excited when they heard that, because that was a he's like, do we really want to flip this switch when it's never really been flipped before? Part of the pushback was, well, of course, societies, we have to move, slavery has always been on. We have to move away from our bigotry, and because something has been around for a long time, it may be a bigoted position. Justice Alito answered that when he asked, there have been cultures that did not frown on homosexuality. That's not a universal opinion throughout history and across all cultures. Ancient Greece is an example. It was well accepted within certain bounds. But did they have same-sex marriage in ancient Greece? And Alito's right. Plato writes about homosexual unions. Usually there was a young lover for all of the old teachers, but there was no homosexual unions. Ms. Bonato said, I don't believe they had anything comparable to what we have, Your Honor. And we're talking about, and Alito says, well, they had marriage, didn't they? Yeah, they had, yes. They had some sort of marriage. Alito continues, and they had same-sex relations, did they not? Yes, and they were also able to, he goes, people like Plato wrote in favor of that, did he not? In favor of? Yeah, Plato wrote approvingly of same-sex relationships, did he not? I believe so, Your Honor. So their limiting marriage to couples of the opposite sex was not based on prejudice against gay people, was it? I can't speak to what was happening with the ancient philosophers. Yeah, you see the problem here. So Alito, I thought, pressed a very cogent point. To assume that the barring of homosexual couples from marriage is one of prejudice is a faulty assumption, because it ignores the nature of humanity. And that's what he was trying to get at.